Pong, Space Invaders, Pac-Man, and Mario, how did we go from the arcade to the PS5? Well, you won't need a quarter to find out. The 1970s. Once upon a time, video games were most associated with video arcades. It might seem strange to think about gamers having to leave their house with a pocket full of quarters just to play their favorite games. But back then, people didn't have the same access to games that we have now. In the early 70s, Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney created the first ever commercially sold coin-operated video game. It was called Computer Space. Unfortunately for Bushnell and Dabney, the game was not successful, but it did make history and paved the way for all the arcade games that came after it. Soon after Computer Space's release, the pair launched Atari and released Pong. The simple 2D game of table tennis was the first commercially successful video game. At the time, it was truly revolutionary. There were many arcade games released during the 70s, but one of the biggest ones was Space Invaders. It has been credited with ushering in the golden age of the arcade. Space Invaders was a massive hit, popularizing the classic shoot-'em-up genre. Another space-themed shooter, Asteroids, was released at the end of the decade. It climbed its way up to becoming Atari's best-selling video game. Other popular arcade games that made their debut during the 70s include Galaxian, Anti-Aircraft, Tank, Lunar Lander, and Star Raiders. Outside the world of arcade games, the American company Coleco produced a handheld electronic game called Electronic Quarterback. As the title suggests, it was a handheld football game. This was far from the handheld devices of today. The graphics consisted of dashes to represent the players. No big touchdown dances in this game. It was in 1977 that Atari brought their games to you with the release of the Atari 2600, the first popular home gaming system. While the famous gaming system saw its heyday in the early 80s, this would be the beginning of a new multi-billion-dollar industry, home gaming. While the Atari 2600 may have been popular, it still didn't stop kids from plunking down quarters and hanging out at the arcade. And if you weren't a fan of video games, you could always play pinball. While pinball had been around for many years, the 70s saw digital displays and solid-state electronics added to pinball machines. As video games got more and more popular, they started to outshine pinball at the arcades. This resulted in many of the pinball machines being swapped out to make way for video game machines. Money talked, and video games were generating more revenue for the arcade owners. The 80s. The early to mid-80s were the golden age of arcade games. Who doesn't recognize the iconic game character Pac-Man? Namco's most popular game garnered a huge fan base, successfully appealing to both male and female audiences. Through a licensing deal, Pac-Man would also become Atari's best-selling game cartridge. Another popular game of the day was the iconic platform game Donkey Kong. Mario might be Nintendo's official mascot today, but he made his first appearance in Donkey Kong. The plumber in red was not originally referred to as Mario. He was known simply as Jumpman, a fitting title for a character who loved to jump. Other popular games at the arcade included Frogger, Centipede, Q*bert, Miss Pac-Man, and the game with the animation graphics, Dragon's Lair. We might have photorealistic graphics in our games today, but it was a process getting there. Pop culture juggernaut, the Star Wars film franchise, made its way into the world of gaming. Atari released an arcade game allowing players to experience the original Star Wars Death Star trench run. The game used 3D color vector graphics. But what made the game even more immersive was the use of digitized voices taken from the films. For a little while, Star Wars fans could experience the thrill of being an X-Wing pilot. Another popular movie-based game at the time was Tron. The 80s was also a time when many of the games you could play at the arcade you could now play at home. New players were starting to take over the scene when it came to home game consoles, and by the end of the decade, the showdown was between Nintendo and their best-selling NES and the Sega Genesis gaming console. Consoles like the Atari 2600 and ColecoVision from earlier in the decade were now practically obsolete. The demand was now for a better home gaming experience, and some companies were ready to deliver, while others faded into the background. Hit that like button and subscribe. It's easier than getting a high score. The 1990s. By the time the 90s arrived, the golden age of arcade gaming had already been over for several years. But just because arcades weren't at their peak didn't mean they were dead. During the 90s, fighting games found a huge audience at the arcades. There were a lot of them, including Street Fighter, Tekken, Mortal Kombat, Virtua Fighter, and Killer Instinct. They were criticized for their level of violence, raising concern about the possible psychological effects they could have on kids. Mortal Kombat was a concerned parent's worst nightmare, featuring gore and brutal finishing moves called fatalities. With each Mortal Kombat release, the games only got more and more violent. The over-the-top violence was a staple of the franchise and what the franchise was best known for. But not all games were about beating up enemies. Konami's Dance Dance Revolution made a spectacular debut, getting people to show off their dance moves, or lack of, at the arcades. However, the game did not really encourage freestyle dancing. Players had to stand on a platform and step on the 4 arrow pads as they watched what came down on the screen. By the end of the 90s, many had turned their attention towards consoles. Many people had bought the Nintendo 64, Sega Saturn, and the very first PlayStation. Even though it was released in the summer of 1989, the Nintendo Game Boy was really a child of the 90s. The Game Boy became the first handheld video game that allowed you to swap out cartridges to play different games that were available for the device. Forget about the arcade or even plugging into your TV at home. You now had your favorite game in your pocket, ready to play anywhere. Popular games and series for the device included Tetris, Pokémon, Super Mario, and The Legend of Zelda, among others. Home gaming was becoming more popular, and neighborhood arcades were starting to disappear for good. The 2000s. Gaming consoles and handheld devices really took arcades down a notch during the 2000s. Home gaming systems were improving at lightning speed, and gamers no longer felt the need to visit the arcade and pay each time they wanted to play. If you had a portable game system, you could even play if you weren't at home. The Game Boy Advance, Nintendo DS, and the PlayStation Portable were staples of the decade. Game consoles released during the 2000s included the PlayStation 2 from Sony, the very first Xbox from Microsoft, and the Nintendo GameCube. Back then, games did not have post-launch support to patch in fixes and squash technical bugs. Games had to be released with a high level of polish. Some of the most popular games during this era were Super Smash Bros. Melee, Halo Combat Evolved, The Sims, Grand Theft Auto Vice City, and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. The early 2000s consoles were eventually phased out to make way for the next generation. Sony's PlayStation 3 succeeded the PlayStation 2, Microsoft's Xbox 360 replaced the original Xbox, and a new console called the Nintendo Wii was also released. Taking gaming into the next phase, all 3 of the consoles featured Wi-Fi support, allowing players to play with their friends and other players online. While Nintendo and Sony provided online multiplayer services at no additional cost, those who were on Xbox had to pay for an online subscription called Xbox Live. Some of the most beloved games of all time were released during this console generation. The list includes Wii Sports, Mass Effect, Halo 3, Rock Band and Guitar Hero, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, Assassin's Creed, and Uncharted. With each company trying to outdo the other with each new release, gamers were the ultimate winners. The 2010s. The console wars continued as Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo released new consoles during the 2010s. Nintendo's Wii U was unfortunately not the success that both Nintendo and their fans were hoping for. It featured a gamepad with its own screen, or it could be hooked up to a television screen. To many customers, the Wii U seemed more like a tablet device for the Wii rather than truly being a brand new console. Low sales and poor reception were disappointing, but it did eventually lead to the very successful Nintendo Switch. First released in 2017, the Switch continued Nintendo's venture into tablet technology. The Switch was able to switch between a tablet mode and a docked mode. Nintendo fans were able to play their games on the go or play their games on a traditional television screen or monitor. Sony's PlayStation 4 and Microsoft's Xbox One were considered direct competitors when released. Thanks to a disastrous console reveal and press conference for the Xbox One, the PlayStation 4 sold more than twice the number of Xbox One consoles. While the PlayStation 4 marketed itself as a powerful next-gen console, the Xbox One was revealed as something players could use to watch television. That's not exactly what gamers buy consoles for. Additionally, the Xbox One was originally not able to play used games and always had to remain connected online. When people asked what they were to do if they wanted to play offline, they were told to go buy an Xbox 360. Microsoft spent the entire console generation rectifying their mistakes and playing catch-up. With so many people having access to smartphones, the 2010s experienced a large boom in mobile gaming. People were now able to play anywhere at any time, so long as they had their iPad or their phone. Some mobile games required players to purchase the game up front. Others offered a small part of the game and asked players to pay to keep playing. This was referred to as the freemium model. In contrast to freemium, some games were entirely free and made developers money through in-game advertising. The developers would sometimes offer a way to disable the ads through an in-app purchase. Some of the most popular mobile games of the 2010s were Angry Birds, Pokemon Go, Candy Crush Saga, Fruit Ninja, and Clash of Clans. The 2010s also saw the rise in popularity of esports and professional video game leagues. Who would have thought back when Pong was released that a few decades later people would be getting paid to play video games? The 2020s. When the pandemic had people staying at home, demand for digital entertainment skyrocketed. This was around the time that a new generation of game consoles were scheduled to release. Add in supply chain issues and a huge problem with online scalpers, securing a new console was made very, very difficult. Unless gamers were willing to fork over ridiculous amounts of cash to someone reselling a PlayStation 5 or Xbox Series X, they were out of luck. Even PC gamers had great difficulty purchasing new parts for their builds, such as graphics cards. In the meantime, both esports and Twitch streams continue to dominate the world of gaming. Some of the most popular esports tournament titles have been League of Legends, Overwatch, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and Valorant. It seems like today, every gamer wants to become a streamer and make it big. Modern games have also turned heavily towards live service models. The games are meant to continuously receive patches and content updates, which has been criticized because games are now rarely in a polished state at launch. Call of Duty Warzone, Fortnite, and Apex Legends are among the many live service titles. In the modern gaming market, digital in-game goodies are more valuable and expensive than ever. Despite backlash from consumers, companies such as Square Enix and Ubisoft have even begun introducing NFTs in their games. As technology advances, so does the world of video games. VR gaming is becoming more accessible, allowing the future of video games to step into the metaverse. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.